Young-suk had ruled Seoul's underworld with an iron fist for a decade. Feared, obeyed, and utterly unstoppable, until a single drop of ghost poison turned his powerful body into a living tomb. No movement, no escape, no way to stop the vultures circling his throne. Paralysis was the price his enemies demanded for his empire. But that rainy evening, as he sat frozen in his study, his new maid didn't just tidy the room. She saw the lie the doctors were feeding him. With trembling hands, she brought a plate that glowed with a strange, neon green light, one meal that no hospital could provide. The city lights of Seoul blurred through the rain-streaked windows, casting cold, blue shadows across Young-suk's charcoal suit. Inside, he was screaming, but on the outside, he was ashen, his tattooed skin slick with a cold, deathly sweat. He was a prisoner in his own skin, forced to watch his captains plot his end while he couldn't even blink. Leah moved like a shadow through the room, her stark white uniform a sharp contrast against the dark mahogany walls. She was supposed to be invisible, just another set of hands to scrub the floors. But then, she froze. Her dark, intense eyes locked onto the medicine dripping into his arm, then shifted to his face. She stepped closer, her athletic frame tense with a dangerous urgency. Ignoring the frantic, panicked yells of the older housekeeper at the door, Leah reached out. She didn't offer a pill or a prayer. She guided a spoon of the glowing, aromatic broth toward his lips, a forbidden touch that carried a death sentence if she was wrong. Young-suk stiffened. A sharp, searing heat flooded his veins, fighting the icy grip of the toxin. And then, for the first time in weeks, the silence of his muscles shattered. He felt his pulse, the heat of the meal, and the sudden, violent return of his own strength. The world had become a dark, cold cage. I sat in my large leather chair, looking out at the rain hitting the windows of my office. From the outside, I looked like a king resting. On the inside, I was screaming. My skin felt like cold stone. I could feel the beads of sweat on my forehead, but I could not reach up to wipe them away. The ghost poison had done its job well. It had turned my strong, tattooed body into a heavy prison. In front of my desk, 3 of my top captains stood. They did not look worried. In fact, they looked excited. They spoke about me as if I were already a ghost. They didn't know that I could hear every word they said. The doctors say he won't last the night, one captain said, his voice full of fake sadness. He leaned against my bookshelf, touching the expensive books I had worked so hard to buy. It is time we talk about his inheritance. Someone needs to lead the family. I should take the docks, another one whispered. He was the youngest, and his eyes were greedy. Young-suk is too weak now. He was always too careful. We can make twice as much money if we stop following his old rules. I watched them through my blurry eyes. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to grab them by their collars and show them that the king was still here. But my muscles refused to move. I was trapped behind my own face, watching my life's work being torn apart by vultures. The air in the room felt thick and smelled like the bitter medicine the doctors gave me every hour. Each drop of that liquid felt like another iron bar being added to my cage. The youngest captain stepped closer to me. He looked at my hand, where a large dragon tattoo wrapped around my wrist. He laughed quietly. Look at him. The great Young-suk, reduced to a doll in a suit. I could feel my heart beating slowly. It was the only part of me that was still mine. I looked past them, toward the door. I saw a flash of white fabric. It was the new maid, Leah. She was quiet, moving like a shadow in the background with her long braids tucked back. Unlike the men in the room, she wasn't looking at my desk or my money. She was looking straight at my eyes. She saw the scream I was hiding. At that moment, among all the men who called themselves my brothers, the only person who actually saw me was the girl who was supposed to be invisible. The study was quiet, except for the soft sound of my shoes on the rug. Young-suk sat in his large chair, as still as a statue. He looked like a king made of stone. His eyes were open, but they did not move. Only the sweat on his forehead showed that his body was fighting a hard battle. I moved around him, pretending to dust the mahogany shelves. I had learned to be a ghost in this house, never seen and never heard. On the small table next to him sat a tray of glass medicine vials. They were supposed to be his cure, brought in every day by expensive doctors in white coats. I reached out to move the tray, but then I stopped. I noticed something small. Yesterday, the liquid in the vials had a light blue tint. Today, the liquid was clear, but it had a strange, oily film floating on the top. It looked like the slick of a puddle after a heavy rain. I looked at the trash bin in the corner. A small, broken seal from a bottle lay at the bottom. It was not a medical seal. It was the kind of seal used for industrial chemicals. My heart began to beat fast against my ribs. The doctors weren't trying to wake him up. They were the ones keeping him under. They were not healers, they were assassins hiding in plain sight. I looked back at Young-suk. He was the most powerful man in the city, but right now, he was a prisoner in his own skin. He was trapped behind a wall of poison, and the people he trusted were the ones building the wall higher every day. Outside, the cool blue rain of Seoul hammered against the glass windows. I knew if I said something, no one would believe a maid. The captains would call me a liar, and I would disappear before the sun came up. I had to do something, but I had to do it alone. I looked at the dark tattoos on his hands. They were beautiful and scary, symbols of a man who never showed weakness. Now, those hands were limp. I realized that if I didn't act, Young-suk would never wake up to see his enemies circling him. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was the only person who knew the truth. I slipped a small, empty vial into my apron pocket and hurried toward the kitchen. I had a different kind of medicine to make. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked like a beating heart. It was midnight, and the large house was finally quiet. I moved through the shadows of the hallway, making sure my soft shoes did not make a sound on the cold floor. I was a ghost in a white uniform, heading toward the one place where I could change everything. When I reached the kitchen, the air smelled like expensive soap and cold steel. Everything was too clean, too perfect. It was a room for show, not for healing. I did not turn on the bright overhead lights. Instead, I used a small flashlight. The thin beam of light danced over the marble counters as I reached into the hidden pocket of my black apron. I pulled out a small bundle wrapped in old cloth. Inside were the ingredients I had gathered from the hidden corners of the city. These were not the chemical pills the doctors gave Young-suk. These were roots and spices from home, the kind my grandmother used to say could wake up the dead. I set a small pot on the stove. My hands were trembling, but I forced them to be steady. If the guards caught me now, they would think I was trying to finish what the poison started. They would not see a cure, they would see a killer. I began to chop the roots. The sound was a rhythmic thump-thump against the wood. I added a splash of water and watched as the liquid began to simmer. Slowly, the smell changed. The sharp, bitter scent of the medicine the doctors used was replaced by something warm and earthy. It smelled like rain on dry soil. As the pot heated, a strange thing happened. The mixture began to glow with a soft, neon green light. It looked eerie in the dark kitchen, casting long shadows against the walls. This was the ghost poison's enemy. It was the only thing strong enough to break the wall inside Young-suk's body. I watched the steam rise, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought about the boss sitting alone in his study, trapped in his own skin. He was a dangerous man, but nobody deserved to be buried alive in their own body. I poured the glowing broth into a small bowl. It was hot, and the warmth seeped through my fingers. I had 4 minutes before the guards did their next round. I covered the bowl and slipped back into the shadows. I was no longer just a maid cleaning floors. I was carrying the only hope for the king of the city, and I had to reach him before the vultures did. The kitchen was quiet, but the air felt thick and heavy. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I chopped the rare roots and spices I had hidden in my uniform. The only sound was the rain hitting the windows of the tall building. I knew I was running out of time. Young-suk was upstairs, trapped in his own body, and the medicine the doctors gave him was like a slow-moving fire in his veins. "What are you doing, girl?" I jumped, nearly dropping my knife. Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, stood in the doorway. Her silvery hair was messy, and her eyes were wide with a deep, chilling fear. She looked at the strange, glowing green meal on the stove and then at me. Her face went pale, like she had seen a ghost. "Stop this right now," she whispered, her voice cracking. She stepped into the kitchen and pointed a shaky finger at the pot. "The doctors say he needs rest. They say no one is allowed to touch his food. If they find you with that, they will not just fire you. They will make sure you are never seen again." I didn't stop stirring. "The doctors are the ones killing him, Mrs. Park. Look at him. He is ashen. He is sweating. He is dying right in front of us." Mrs. Park grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for an older woman. "It does not matter. This is a mafia house. We are ghosts here. We stay silent and we stay alive. If you go into that study with that plate, you are signing a death warrant for both of us." I looked into her panicked eyes. I knew she was terrified. She had spent her whole life following the rules to stay safe. But I couldn't be a ghost anymore. I couldn't watch a man be buried alive while I held the key to his cage. "I am going up there," I said, my voice low and firm. "I would rather die trying to save him than live knowing I let them kill him." Mrs. Park let go of my arm and backed away. She covered her mouth with her hands, a sob escaping her lips. "They will kill you, Leah. They will burn this city down before they let a maid fix what they broke." I didn't answer. I poured the glowing green broth into a silver bowl. The light from the meal reflected off my white uniform and hit the dark walls. I ignored the cold chill of fear in my stomach. I walked past her, out of the kitchen, and toward the heavy mahogany doors of the study. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Park's shaky breaths as she watched me walk toward a fate we both feared. The heavy oak doors of the study felt like a wall between life and death. I took a deep breath and pushed them open. The room was dark, filled with the smell of old books and the cold, sharp scent of rain hitting the windows. Young-suk sat in his large chair. He looked like a statue made of pale stone. His eyes were open and wide, staring at nothing, but I knew he could see me. "Leah! Stop right now," the head housekeeper hissed from the hallway. Her face was white with fear, and her fingers shook as she pointed at me. To touch the boss without being asked was a crime. To interfere with his medicine was a death sentence. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I walked toward him, my white uniform glowing in the dim light. I held the bowl tightly in my hands. The meal I had cooked was warm, and a strange, green glow rose from the broth. It was the only thing that could fight the ghost poison, freezing his blood. Young-suk's skin was ashen, and beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. I could see the ink of his tattoos, the dragons and swirling patterns, looking dull against his sickly skin. I set the bowl down on the mahogany desk. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I know you are in there," I whispered, my voice low and steady. "And I know they are lying to you." I reached out and performed the forbidden touch. I placed my hand firmly on his tattooed shoulder. His body was ice-cold and stiff. The housekeeper let out a muffled scream behind me, but I ignored her. I used my other hand to cup his jaw, gently tilting his head back. This was the moment that changed everything. I was no longer just a maid, I was the only person holding his life in my hands. I picked up the spoon. The neon green liquid shimmered. "Eat," I commanded softly. I guided the spoon to his lips. He couldn't move, but as the warmth of the first swallow hit his tongue, I saw a spark in his dark eyes. It was a flash of raw, focused life. I fed him slowly, one spoonful at a time, for 4 long minutes. Outside, the rain hammered against the glass like bullets. Inside, the silence was thick and heavy. With every bite, the gray color in his face began to fade. The heat from the meal was working. I felt a tiny twitch in the muscles of his shoulder under my palm. The prison was starting to crack. I didn't pull my hand away. I stayed right there, looking into the eyes of the most dangerous man in Seoul, waiting for the king to wake up. The heat from the soup was the first thing I felt in weeks. For so long, my body had been a block of ice. I was trapped inside a cold, dark tomb made of my own skin. I could hear the rain hitting the windows of my study, but I couldn't even shiver. The poison felt like gray sludge in my veins. Then came Leah. She didn't listen to the doctors. She didn't listen to the terrified cries of the older woman by the door. She just held the spoon to my lips with hands that did not shake. As the first swallow went down, it felt like a spark hitting dry wood. The broth was thick and tasted of earth and ancient secrets. It wasn't like the chemical medicine the doctors used. This was alive. I felt a glow start in my chest. It was a small, green flame that began to eat away at the gray ice of the poison. I watched Leah's face. Her dark eyes were steady and filled with a strange power. She wasn't looking at me like I was a dying man. She was looking at me like I was a king who just needed to wake up. The light from the meal cast green shadows across her sharp cheekbones. The warmth began to spread. It moved down my arms and into my legs. It was a slow, pulsing heat that fought the cold every inch of the way. My heart, which had been beating like a tired drum, suddenly found a new rhythm. "Move," I told myself. "Fight it." For weeks, I had screamed that command into the silence of my mind with no result. But this time, something changed. Deep inside my right hand, there was a tiny spark. It felt like a needle prick. The ghost poison was heavy, but the meal was stronger. Leah leaned closer, her breath warm against my cheek. "Stay with me, Young-suk," she whispered. I focused every bit of my will on my hand. I poured all my anger and all my hope into my hand. Then, it happened. My index finger gave a small, sudden twitch against the leather of the chair. It was a tiny movement, almost invisible to anyone else, but to me, it felt like an earthquake. The ice was cracking. The ghost was leaving my blood. I wasn't just a prisoner anymore. I was coming back, and the city was going to pay for what it did to me. I looked at Leah, and for the first time, I didn't see a maid. I saw the only person in Seoul who was brave enough to bring me back from the dead. The air in the study felt thick and cold, even with the warm amber glow of the lamps. Young-suk sat perfectly still in his large chair, his charcoal suit unbuttoned just as Leah had left it. To anyone looking in, he was still the Ashen King, a man whose body was a silent tomb. But inside, the one meal was doing its work. A searing heat moved through his veins, fighting the icy grip of the ghost poison. For the first time in weeks, he could feel the weight of his own hands and the texture of the leather chair against his tattooed skin. The heavy oak doors creaked open. Young-suk did not flinch, though his mind was now sharp and alert. 3 of his top captains walked in, their expensive shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood floor. They did not come with flowers or kind words. They came with the smell of expensive cigars and the heavy scent of betrayal. "He looks worse today," one captain said, his voice full of fake sadness. He stepped closer, leaning over Young-suk's frozen form. He even dared to blow smoke into the face of the man he used to fear. "The doctors say it won't be long now. By tomorrow, Seoul will belong to us." Another captain laughed, a dry and cruel sound. He reached out and tapped a finger against Young-suk's tattooed neck, right over a dragon's wing. "To think we were afraid of this statue for so many years. He can't even blink while we divide up his life's work." Young-suk heard every word. He felt the disrespect of their touch and the greed in their voices. In the shadows near the door, he caught a glimpse of Leah. She was standing tense and athletic, her dark eyes watching the traitors with an intense focus. She knew the truth. She was the only one who knew that the king was no longer a prisoner. As the men laughed and shared their plans to dismantle his empire, Young-suk felt a sudden, violent surge of strength. Underneath the table, hidden from their sight, his right index finger twitched. The heat from Leah's meal was reaching his heart, turning his fear into a cold, quiet fury. The traitors thought they were in a room with a dead man, but they were actually standing in a cage with a predator who was finally waking up. Young-suk waited, counting their breaths, preparing for the moment he would show them exactly what happened to those who tried to bury him alive. The heat from the meal was like a fire spreading through my chest. For weeks, my body had felt like a cold stone, heavy and still. But as the last of the glowing broth slid down my throat, the ice began to melt. I felt a sharp sting in my fingertips. Then, a sudden throb in my heart. Leah stood over me, her breath coming in quick gasps. Her dark eyes were wide, watching my face for any sign of life. Behind her, the older housekeeper was still shaking, her hands over her mouth as if she expected me to crumble into dust. I didn't crumble. I felt a surge of energy so violent it made my vision blur. The ghost poison had kept me a prisoner, but this meal was the key to the lock. I took a deep breath, a real breath that filled my lungs until they ached. Slowly, I curled my fingers. My skin, once ashen and gray, began to flush with a deep, healthy warmth. The dark tattoos on my hands and wrists seemed to come alive, rippling over my muscles as they finally woke up. I gripped the arms of my chair. The wood groaned under my touch. I pushed myself upward. My legs felt shaky for a split second, like a newborn colt, but then the fury took over. It was a flood of heat and anger that burned away the last of the toxin. I stood tall, my head nearly touching the amber glow of the lamp. I was no longer a trapped spirit. I was the king of Seoul again. I looked at my hands. The tattoos of dragons and ancient patterns looked sharp and dangerous against my skin. I wasn't just back, I was stronger. The sweat on my brow felt like a baptism. I turned my head toward the door, where I could hear the muffled voices of the men who had betrayed me. They thought they were coming to check on a dying man. They didn't know the monster was awake. I looked at Leah. She didn't look away. She didn't bow like a servant. She stood her ground, her athletic frame tense and ready. She had risked everything to bring me back from the grave. "You did well," I rasped. My voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it was mine. I straightened my charcoal suit jacket and unbuttoned my cuffs. The cold rain continued to beat against the windows, but the chill was gone from my bones. I stepped away from the table, my footsteps heavy and sure on the mahogany floor. Every inch of me burned with a need for justice. The city thought it had lost its master, but they were about to find out what happens when you try to bury a man who still has fire in his blood. The rain in Seoul did not stop. It washed over the glass windows of the penthouse, but inside, the air was cold and sharp. Young-suk stood by the window. He was no longer the ashen, frozen man who could not move. His strength had returned in a sudden, violent flood thanks to Leah's meal. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, his dark tattoos rippling over his knuckles as he tightened his grip. They thought they could bury me while I was still breathing, Young-suk said. His voice was low and dangerous, like the growl of a predator. Leah stood a few feet behind him. She was no longer just a maid in a white uniform. She was the witness to his rebirth. She watched as Young-suk picked up a burner phone from the mahogany desk. With a few quick motions, he sent the signal. The city was about to wake up to a nightmare. The purge began at the docks. Young-suk did not hide in the shadows. He arrived in a black sedan, his presence cutting through the mist. The captains who had laughed about dividing his empire were gathered there, counting money they hadn't earned. When the car door opened and Young-suk stepped out, the laughter died instantly. Their faces turned as pale as Young-suk's had been just hours before. He didn't need to say much. His men, loyal once they saw their king was alive, moved like ghosts through the rain. One by one, the traitors were removed. There were no long speeches. Young-suk simply watched as the people who had tried to poison him were led away into the dark. Next was the doctor. The man who had spiked the medicine was found trying to flee the city with a suitcase full of cash. Young-suk met him in a quiet parking garage. The doctor fell to his knees, begging for mercy, claiming he was forced to do it. Young-suk leaned down, his eyes cold and dark. "You watched me stay awake while my body died," Young-suk whispered. "You saw the fear in my eyes and you kept dripping the poison." He didn't look back as his guards finished the job. By the time the sun began to peek through the gray clouds of Seoul, the traitors were gone. The ghost poison had failed. The rivals who thought they could dismantle a legacy had been dismantled instead. Young-suk returned to the penthouse as the city started to stir. His suit was damp from the rain, but his step was heavy and sure. He found Leah waiting by the balcony. He looked at his hands, they were steady now. The people who tried to bury him were under the earth, and the man they feared was more powerful than ever. The purge was finished. Seoul belonged to him again. The air in the high-rise office was finally clear. The heavy smell of the ghost poison and the fake medicine was gone, replaced by the fresh scent of the city after a storm. I stood by the large windows and looked out at Seoul. The blue and amber lights below seemed to sparkle for us. Behind me, I heard the crisp sound of paper being moved. Young-suk was sitting at his heavy mahogany desk. He looked strong again. His skin was no longer ashen, and the tattoos on his neck and hands stood out darkly against his white shirt. He did not look like a man who had been a prisoner in his own body just days ago. He looked like a king who had reclaimed his throne. He held two sets of papers in his hands. One was the contract that forced me to work as his maid. The other was the record of the debt that had kept me a ghost for so long. He looked at them for a moment, then he picked up a silver lighter. With a small click, a flame appeared. He touched the fire to the edge of the papers. We both watched as the orange flames began to eat the words that had held me down. The debt and the service turned into black ash, falling into a tray on his desk. When the fire reached his fingers, he dropped the last piece and watched it vanish. You are not a ghost anymore, Leah, Young-suk said. His voice was deep and steady, filled with a respect I had never heard before. The people who tried to kill me thought you were nobody. They were wrong. You were the only one who truly saw me. He stood up and walked around the desk. He didn't point to the door or tell me to go back to my cleaning. Instead, he pulled out the heavy leather chair right next to his own. It was a seat at the main table, a place where only the most powerful people were allowed to sit. I have many men who can fight, he whispered, looking into my eyes. But I have no one I can trust to tell me the truth. From now on, you don't work for this house. You work with me. I felt a strange warmth in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to be seen. I walked forward and took the seat. I sat down next to the most dangerous man in the city, no longer a maid in a white uniform, but his most trusted partner. The sun began to rise over the mountains, and I knew my life as a shadow was over. My new life was just beginning.